Okay.
Everyone, let's welcome Amanda Hamon and Wes Schneider to Dragon Talk. Yay!
Yay! Woohoo!
This is totally the theater kids welcoming the goth kids to this podcast.
Fair.
Yes.
I mean, this is the best.
I don't try to be goth. I just kind of like look like this.
I'm just drawn that way.
Yeah, I'm just drawn this way.
Well, this is apropos because we'll be talking to you about Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. Wes and I have been doing some fun Lore You Should Know's deep dives on the Domains of Dread and getting to know a little bit more about it. And Amanda, you were able to work on the Barovia section of this book, right?
I was, yeah. I worked on the Barovia section and the Lamordia section and a couple of the genre horror sections. It was a great opportunity.
Nice.
And you worked on this before you were a full-time wizard, even.
I was. It's a wonderful coincidence that I was a freelance writer on a couple of projects, including this one, and had no idea that when the book was coming out, I would be a senior designer on the team.
How perfect is that?
Yeah.
You just cast a hex and things seem to happen. Maybe it has to do with the necklace you have around your neck.
Yeah.
Oh, well, yes. For those of you watching at home, because I'm nothing if not incredibly cheesy and on brand at all times.
Always
This
be Brandon.
pendant that is around my neck was a gift from a friend who got it from a website called Mini Museum, and they have filled this pendant with grave soil from the ancestral castle of Vlad Tepes, aka Strahd, aka Dracula, aka the person who all this is about, right?
How does one get the grave soil?
I think it's just normal soil. I think they call it grave soil just to sound cool. I think
But
it's
I
just
mean, like,
something
from
around the area.
Okay. I mean, yeah.
It basically is somebody playing in the dirt selling a thing for like, however much this costs.
So that you can,
But
so you can
it's
mention it in
cool.
your
It
you can mention
totally
in your
is.
interview about when you're going to start working on Ravenloft. You're like, all right, yeah, you're in.
Yeah.
Pretty much. It's like, let me tell you how dedicated I am. Also, look at that picture behind me.
What's that for those
What
that people
can't-
can't
It
see?
is
What
an
is that?
old playbill from a Dracula production, I believe, that actually Wes's husband Russ gave me a long time ago for
Aw.
Christmas as a gift. So that is only a couple of the many Dracula themed things that I have in my house because nerd.
Dracula nerd to be.
Strahd themed things,
Wow.
if you will.
So I like that you guys have a history. You,
Yes.
Wes and Amanda.
Sure.
A gothic lineage history. Something trying to tie it back here, but
Right. You're part of a
Spooky
coven,
nerds.
I think.
spooky nerds that go way back.
So yeah, Wes, when did you two meet? When did you guys start working together?
Oh, jeez.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
A while ago.
That's when I'm just
You're
like,
just-
when was it, Wes? How
You're
long has it
leading.
been, Wes?
That's so Greg, just leading with those hard-hitting questions right off the
Yeah,
bat.
right.
How do you know each other?
Where were you
Um,
on April 14th?
No, it's actually funny. We met on the Gen Con showroom floor,
Yeah.
like back in 2012, 13.
I realized because I was going through old emails and I have in my freelance email that I've used forever and ever, I have a whole bunch of old stuff. It was 10 years ago this summer.
Wow.
Yeah.
Anniversary.
Yeah. So August.
Yep,
And
and we're
it-
still both in our 20s, and
You were children when you met. It was
Yep.
probably
And still are.
a daycare. And were you
Damn it.
drawn to the grave soil around Amanda's neck? Did you like just walk right up to her and like, hey?
actually,
I know that smell.
No, actually, I'll let Amanda tell how we ended up running into each other.
Oh my gosh. Well, I had been going to Gen Con for a long time, even at that point. I think my first year was 2006 at Gen Con, and just going as a fan, really getting involved in the tabletop industry, realizing that, I loved the tabletop industry because it was so accessible. At places like Gen Con, you could go and you could meet various industry professionals and people who were really well known, and Wes was one of the many folks that I met. But I hit a point after I'd been going for a few years where I had been a journalist and a communication specialist in a degree in journalism and creative writing. And I wanted to get into a career that I knew I would be happier in. I knew I was looking to change careers. And so in 2011, I finally went, okay, well, I think I would be great in the tabletop industry. I'm really interested in becoming a writer or an editor. I'm going to approach some of these folks who I know attend this convention and see if anyone is interested in what I thought would probably be, the most reliable thing to get into at the time was freelance editing. So I went around to multiple folks at multiple companies, giving out business cards and saying, hey, I've been playing tabletop games. I'm a professional writer and editor. And, if you have anything of interest, please keep me in mind. And Wes was the person that I met over at Paizo at the time, who I believe you were editor-in-chief at the time. Yep. Wes was the big cheese. And so I handed him my card and, gave him my spiel and everything and said, oh, do you have any freelance editing available? And Wes, without missing a beat, said, well, we don't have any freelance editors that we use, but are you interested in game design?
What?
And immediately sort of went like, I could do that? I could do game design? I don't think I can do game design, but just my mouth said, sure, of course.
Good.
Yep. And then he and I got in contact afterwards. They had me submit some monster pitches for one of the old Adventure Path lines, and everything just kind of spiraled from there. I got involved in lots of companies and doing lots of work, and sitting here at Wizards today.
That's amazing.
Reunited. I love it.
And it's perfect for this product too, because so much of, I think, your proclivities is all about this horror themed stuff that's going to be front and center for Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. So we've been talking about it a lot here on the podcast, but Wes, for folks, like what can we give for them? What's the overview of this book, and how would you do this in an elevator pitch trying to get a D&D fan who's into horror to want to pick it up?
So this is Dungeons and Dragons Does Horror. This is a return to the Ravenloft campaign setting from back in the 80s and 90s. This picks up pretty much right where Curse of Strahd, one of 5th edition's best known, best loved adventures, drops off and is like, hey, did you enjoy Strahd? How about more? How about more flavors of horror? How about more domains? How about more spooky times? How do you do that? How do you run that? What's the world you can set it in? How you can create your own nightmares? How you can create horror stories that are right for you and your players? Monsters, settings, characters, etc.
Nice.
Nailed it.
It's
like you've done it before.
Almost like this has been
like I've been
a huge
saying,
part of my life for a year.
So one thing you say, for fans that like horror, but what I really like about this book too is that there are many different types of horror, but also many different levels of horror. So like you don't have to have a campaign that is just completely 100% steeped in horror. I like that you can add a little bit here, add a little bit there. Like I played a Hexblood character in one of the Candlekeep Mysteries adventures. So it was not a horror themed adventure, but my character really freaked out the rest of the party when I started yanking off my thumbnails and leaving them behind. So
that's creepy, Shelley.
That was 100% creepy, and the party really was grossly disturbed in the best possible way. But I will say, after that game ended, 2 of them were like, so how do I get to be one of these Hexbloods? Like, look at that.
I got the book for you.
Have I got a book for you? So, I think like there is a lot of wonderful customization options in there. Maybe you could, Amanda, perhaps speak to how would a dungeon master or player just kind of pour up bits of their campaign?
Sure. So, like you said, there are levers and dials, right? That dungeon masters have at their disposal to make their game a little bit horror tinged, all the way up to full on survival horror. Everything is terrifying, and the PCs potentially have no hope. Maybe they're trying to gain some hope. So I think really horror is all about tension and suspense, and I think when you're introducing those elements, in any sort of form, that is what starts a game on the track to becoming a horror game. So, I know a lot of folks who have long ongoing campaigns, and a lot of times they'll ask the question like, oh, how can we do a little bit of horror? How can we do a horror sort of side plot or sidetrack and then get back to the rest of the normal campaign? And I think that is entirely possible. And the way to do that is indeed to ramp up that suspense, to create something that has got tension. Maybe there's a time clock that's running. There's an unknown factor that's happening. So it's something like, your PC's discovering something that's scary through little pieces of the environments, and weird implications and things they don't understand. And there being the slow reveal of what is happening to have caused this, maybe with a final reveal that if they don't stop something, find something, accomplish something, then something really awful will happen. And that's a perfect way to introduce horror into an ongoing campaign that can then, after that plot is resolved, shift back onto something that's, a little more normal for that game.
I love all that because, there's something that gets lost, I think, with a lot of just broad descriptions of horror, which is like, oh, it's the monsters or it's the gore, it's the slashy knives, it's that. But so much of horror is the 2 hours leading up to that event, right? And is there stuff within the book about how to kind of create those tension moments using, techniques that are usually cinematic, but for a tabletop role-playing game can feel a little bit, not just the heroic fantasy that is the tropes that a lot of dungeon masters lean on. So yeah, what are some of those things that people can do when they take that tension and build it over the course of a session or a campaign?
Well, we've got a whole section in the book that talks about pretty much that.
Right.
So
it's almost like I knew.
Almost. So one of the big elements for that is like, all right, if you are going to look to create an atmosphere, look to create suspense, look to create tension in the course of your game, how do you do that? And this is something that you can, it's right at home in a horror game, but this can work like for any type of D&D play. But what are the techniques to create that atmosphere? Like, how does that, as a player, how can you feed into that? As a DM, how do you build that? So on and so forth. So we have a pretty lengthy discussion about like, all right, so you want the folks around your table to actually, be leaning in, to be getting really invested in the, like, here's what the story is, like growing that atmosphere, so on and so forth. So we talk a lot about tricks that you can do to do that, ways you can make your surroundings feel more conducive to that, ways you can create props, like, perfect for Ravenloft. Everybody knows the Taroka deck from like Curse of Strahd and like early versions of the adventure Ravenloft. But then also we explore another direction that you can go with that by presenting a spirit board in the book, and that features in the adventure where you're actually gathering around like a Ouija board like prop, and just other things that you can do to sort of blur the barriers between we are sitting at a table with our character sheets in front of us to something that it does get you more in your head, in the collective story, and invested in what happens next, that real sort of ghost story territory.
Yeah, it's true that some of the scariest parts of scary movies or scary books is the anticipation of the thrill. Like, it may never even happen. Like Paranormal Activity was like, what did that cost? Like $5,000 to make that movie? And I was terrified the whole time because I just didn't want to see anything on that baby monitor. And most of the time, nothing appeared. And yet, I will still say that was a terrifying movie. So yeah,
it is one of those things, right, where the horror is the not knowing. And sometimes, we talk about this, Wes and I talk about this a lot when we're talking about philosophy of running horror games. But there's a question of, do you ever actually show the monster? And when you do, how do you do it in an impactful way that doesn't take away from the scariness of what the players have already experienced? And we do talk a bit about that philosophically in the book, I believe.
Yeah. The build-up has to pay off.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the classic examples is playing into that fear of the unknown. If you just say you turn the corner and there's a troll, not scary.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's got a lot of hit points, so maybe a little scary. But you turn the
Regeneration
corner.
sucks.
Exactly, right. But turning the corner and being like, you immediately bump into this like gigantic warty horror that like, but you don't even see it move. You just feel the splash of hot saliva on your face as it's coming for you. What do you do? What is it? What's happening? Gross spit, like, very different reaction than like, oh, it's a troll.
Well, that's really interesting because, you know, I've been, you know, playing D&D for a while, and there are those D&D dungeon masters who will just say like, oh, you see, you know, 3 orcs, or you see a lich, you know, and they don't describe what those things look like and feel like. And you just did a very good job of describing kind of the sensual reaction or you know, the experience of what a troll would look like without ever saying the word troll. And that is so much more powerful using specific examples. You know, it's good in writing, it's good in lots of different parts of our world, but it's really great for dungeon mastering, especially to kind of create that thing. So it doesn't take something and put it to the abstract. You're talking about the actual tactile things that people can feel and touch and see.
Yeah, we actually spend a good amount of time in the book talking about how you do blur some of those lines, how you can really make any D&D monster really feel like this horrific threat. How do you sort of blur the player expectations? How do you add or change abilities to like make things unexpected? And then just how like the descriptions that we use for monsters, we don't have to be beholden to what's in the monster manual, what's, you know, what you see on the page. The more you blur that, the more you create stories that play up the anticipation of a monster as not just the troll, but the bog beast of Hamon. What is that? It's a freaking troll. But now it's a troll that has a legend and so on and so forth, and it's infamous.
And I hate those bog beasts.
So
jerks.
Listening to you talk about, we're talking specifically, you know, about the horror, but it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, this is all good advice for just dungeon mastering in general. It doesn't have to just be horror that you're talking about, like the tension and the descriptions and how, you know, it's better to give a troll a backstory and make him a legend than just be a troll. Mm-hmm. This is very good, just general advice for running games. Just a thought.
Well, I mean, D&D's always been a horror game.
Yeah.
Like the concept of I'm just a little guy and I've got a pointy sword or bad spells, and there sure is a hole out there that has monsters and people don't come out of it. Go. Like that's a horror proposition. Like there's a heroic element to that, certainly, but like so much of D&D, like dragons and mind flayers and ghosts and zombies. I mean, you can find horror stories, novels, movies about all of these, and these are the bread and butter of D&D. So like there's always been that horror element to pretty much any type of adventure. And you can play that up or play that down as much as you want, but it's always there.
I love that Van Richten's can be a guide to the specific domains and stories that we'll get to talking about in a little bit. But then also, you're right, just is a good advice for telling a good, you know, yarn, no matter how you want it to happen. But I wanted to ask you this, Amanda, since I know you've run a fair amount of horror themed games. A lot of the stuff that we were talking about has been like literally talking to us about around the table, and it's a lot easier to create that type of tension when you can, you know, more easily control the ambiance and the atmosphere of the people sitting around in the same physical space. But so many of us are playing digitally now.
Yes.
What are some good thoughts or ways to kind of increase that tension through, I don't know, camera tricks or, you know, turning off all the lights? Is there a way to kind of ramp up that tension through using video conferencing and Zoom like we're all playing D&D now?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I actually just got done running about an 11-month campaign that was essentially a horror game. It was at least a horror themed game. It was not necessarily that really tightly focused horror experience, but it was about pirates, and there was an overall sort of devil worshipping cabal going on behind the background. And the whole game is all about the PCs slowly uncovering who's behind this cabal and what it is that they're trying to do, and then revealing that, oh, the entire plan that they have is to make this whole region of islands subservient to this specific archdevil in hell. Okay, we've got to stop that from happening. That was the whole game. And I ran that game online, of course, because, of quarantine and the pandemic. And so I was constantly thinking of ways things that I could do to really draw the players into the game and the story. And it was a very story focused game. It was largely homebrew. There were some bones of an adventure path behind it, but it was mostly stuff that I was coming up with. So maps that I was building and NPCs that I was creating. And a lot of the strategies that I used were really to think about the sort of mental effects of the game and how the mindsets that I really wanted the players to be in and how to achieve that. So I really wanted the players to be focused on the story, but very much unsure of what exactly was going on throughout the different sessions. And as they uncovered one piece, that it created this foreboding sense that there was something bigger happening. And then they would uncover another piece and another piece and another piece, and would all sort of build out from there. And so I really did that by, just keeping a strategy as the DM of holding onto the information really tightly that they were figuring out, giving them enough information to get them sort of thinking about like, oh my gosh, this pirate captain that we've encountered before might actually be in league with, we know they're devil worshippers, but we don't know who their names are. And I had them going into, there's a couple times I had them actually like find a portal and then be like, oh my, what is this? They walk into the portal, it's into hell, and now they're in the like extra planar meeting space of all of these devilish captains and figuring out like, oh, and then there's this symbol here and this symbol here, and putting together, which archdevils are behind it, and based on what they could find out about them, what they might be trying to accomplish. So I was really very careful with what I revealed when, so that they couldn't jump to the very end of the story, and then it was really kind of no longer scary because they knew what was going on and they could just stop it. I did that. I also did things like I created a lot of handouts. I found a lot of cool art online. I built out maps myself so that there could be specific things that they would find. Like I created maps of hell to sort of give them the idea of where they were. And so there was a lot of different techniques, but, using what Wes described, just those verbal sort of strategies of being very descriptive, having a very visceral sense of everything that's going on, really not holding back from like describing the whole area. There were a lot of times where it's like, oh, they're going through the woods and then they come upon a clearing, and then what they see in the clearing is completely horrific. And I don't know how much detail you want, but those are sort of like, oh, mundane. Oh, and then big terrifying reveal. Like getting the pacing correct was very important on the online game to keep them focused and invested. And it went 11 months, and it seemed like it, everybody seemed to really enjoy it. And I felt like it was pretty successful.
Nice.
And actually, I think Amanda hit on something there that's particularly important, not just for playing in an online sense, but also for running horror, is like the players have to be in the mindset for it. Like if you're just at your computer browsing during a game or like playing another game, then you're not getting invested. So like just laying some ground rules where it's just like, hey, we're here to run a game. We know that, this maybe is not the optimal way of doing this, but we're all here to do this. We want to focus on this, and we're here to invest in the story and whatnot. Sometimes it's as basic as that, as just like put yourself in a mindset to get invested in the story, and that's half the battle.
And that's important from just a general dungeon mastering D&D rule, right? It's like you kind of want to communicate with your players as the dungeon master about what type of themes and things are going to be in the adventure, and having that, those ground rules to set. And that's also really important for players to say, hey, I know this is going to be a horror themed game, or it's going to, verge into some topics, but here's just some things that are, hard passes for me, and other things that you're like, oh, this is all right. And we talk about those in the book too, right, Wes?
Absolutely. We spend a good deal of time talking about how do you craft the type of horror that's right for you as the DM, right for the players, and so on and so forth. So there's a number of discussions about how you run a session 0 for a horror game, what are some questions that you might want to put up to your group, how you can encourage players to answer those authentically, because the last thing that's going to ever happen is, Greg, tell me the worst thing that ever happened to you so we don't put in the game. No, you're not doing that. Like, there's no world, no matter how long I've been playing with someone. I might have been playing with somebody since, for 30 years, but I guarantee you they're never going to tell me the worst thing in their lives or their most traumatizing nightmare or whatever have you. But setting up the opportunities for, like, how do we create some, like, we want to see these elements in the game, we don't want to see these, and then in the course of play, if something does go off the rails or takes a turn that somebody might not even realize is a thing that they don't want to see in a game, how do you adjust on the fly for that? The book talks about a spectrum of ways that you might prepare for those sort of things, so you can pick and choose what's right for you and your group.
And it's important also because some people might not know what's triggering to them until they hear it. Like, even if you did ask me, what's the most horrifying thing that ever happened, and I was willing to tell you, I might not know, until it comes up in the game. So there are tools or tips in here as well to explain, like, how a player might feel comfortable expressing mid-game on the fly. Yes?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it's the sort of thing as well where it's like, some parties will look at these and be like, all right, maybe I only use 1 or 2 of these, or maybe I don't really see the use of it, but I'll have it at my table. Couldn't hurt. There's a lot of discussion about this because, you never really know in a communal storytelling game exactly the way things are going to pan out. Everybody has a voice in this. Everybody can take things a different direction. So making sure that the group's prepared for if something does, zig when it should have zagged, you can account for those sort of things.
It's giving an opportunity to tap out, right? Just to be like, okay, this is, it's an improv technique, and just be like, all right, we're going too far. Let's switch tracks to go something else. Yep. And that's, it's good advice for everybody. So
yeah,
even if you're not running a horror game, take heed to that section here in Van Richten's.
I used to have a reoccurring nightmare when I was a kid that I had eyes in the back of my head. And I would wake up crying, and I saw them crying too. I could see them doing everything I was doing. Like, it was a very lucid, horrifying, reoccurring dream. So
did they just see the back of your hair?
I feel like I could see them with my front eyes. It was very confusing.
In your mind's eye.
In my mind's eye, could see all 4 of my eyes doing the same thing, crying at the same time, blinking at the same time. And I used to wake up with this dream more than just once. It was a reoccurring thing.
So they were eyes in the back of your head that could also see through hair, which is really specific.
Yes.
They're invisible.
I can still picture the shape of them and everything. They were sort of cartoony, but not like cute cartoony.
Are you giving us fodder to use this in a game with you, or are you saying that we should not be using this?
I think that one, I feel like that would be kind of cool to bring up. I would be like, that's awesome.
All right. I'm adding this to my notes.
Put that in an art description somewhere, and we'll give that as a gift to Shelley one day.
Yep.
Transparent hair.
I mean, transparent hair.
Transparent aluminum.
At least no hair monsters would have any stealth against you. You would be like, that's not the wall. That's a monster.
I mean, I don't know why it was terrifying, because as a D&D character,
cool,
it would be really cool to be able to see. I feel like that's actually a spell that you could cast. And I cast eyes in the back of my head, and now you're just like, boop, 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 You can see everything.
I could see it being a little body horror thing because I always think of that. It's played for comedy in Army of Darkness when Ash eats himself and then like an eye pops up on his shoulder. That creeps me the hell out. And the growth of it all, that's disturbing. And I feel like that's in the same vein of what you're talking about.
Yeah, like body parts where they shouldn't be is just scary. It's just kind of gross and scary.
And it happens more and more as you get older.
That's body hair, Greg.
Too real.
That's too real, guys. That's the real horror.
Too much reality in our fantasy horror.
Aging.
But,
Worst
I
horror
mean,
monster ever.
I mean, we're talking about this in a jokey way, but I mean, you're absolutely right. The elements of like the whole concept of your body, which is ostensibly you, but is also host to multitudes and constantly breaking down, and things live on our body and inside us, and there's a global pandemic, so I mean that's a whole thing. Like all of the horror of the things that we don't consider about the thing that is supposedly us, that's a whole genre that a lot of folks hear that and get into that and are like, okay, too real. I came here for like stabbing some mind flayers and whatnot. Like, let's not do all that. But that's definitely something that we end up talking about in the book, is like body horror as a genre is a thing. If you want to play with that, how do you do that? But also, if you don't, how do you make sure that that's a part of town we're not going to? How do we just veer around?
Wes, I really like in the book, in the genre section specifically, how there are tables for generating types of elements for each subgenre that we talk about. So villains and settings and plots that fall into these categories, because I just really like that it's thinking critically about these genres and what makes these genres and what defines them, and it's giving them specific options. I just think there will be some super cool games that folks are able to make given that information.
Absolutely.
It's funny how categories like that, which ultimately are semantics, it's just like an organizational tool, but it does help you almost get more inspired because you're like, oh, well, I want to make a cosmic horror story, so I'm going to do that. Now I know I have the language and the vocabulary to talk about this thing in a way. And so I love that you guys are doing that with horror, especially as pertains to tabletop role-playing games, because it kind of sets the language for discussions like this. But you mentioned body horror, and I believe Lamordia, as well as a couple other of the domains of dread, use body horror as kind of its defining characteristic, right?
Yeah, I'd say a defining characteristic. There are a couple of genres that are touched on in the Lamordia section. I see Wes smiling over there. There's the sort of frozen tundra wastelands of Lamordia, in which we were talking about this section, and it's like there should be something creepy to be discovered within the ice and the glaciers, but don't make it the thing.
We just did that one.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's almost like a steampunky element as well. There's sort of a darker, gritty steampunk element to some of the cities of Lamordia, in which body horror comes into play, because there are definitely discussions of like, oh, and there are probably body snatchers who are operating within this urban area, these different graveyards, and they're transporting these at the behest of the Dark Lord, Victor Mordenheim, who's ensconced in her own castle and doing various experimentations to try to discover a couple of key things to the plot there. So, you've got steampunk stuff going on. You've got a little bit of cosmic horror-y elements going on, addition to the strong body horror element. So, there's a lot of it's a beautiful melting pot of all kinds of subgenres, and you can kind of tell whatever story fascinates you the most. If you don't want to tell a body horror story and the cosmic elements really appeal to you in Lamordia, you can absolutely do that, and you don't even have to touch any of the body snatching or any of the flesh warping or any of those things going on.
Ugh. Flesh warping.
Lovely, delightful, wonderful things.
I think when you said melting pot, Wes kind of broke a little bit, because he was like,
because he's probably thinking about like, oh, melting flesh.
I know, right? I went there too.
Yeah. Literally a melting pot.
Oh, that's America.
But horrible.
It's so great. Also, I love that steampunk is a horror genre now. We're just like, it's horror, basically. There's
We'll
goggles,
definitely make
which
it
are
that
terrible.
Anything can be made horror.
That is true.
Yeah, I think it's the dystopian sort of outlook that we're weaving into the different cities in Lamordia, a couple of different cities. Ludendorff, I think, is definitely one of them. I see Wes nodding. Okay, good. But yeah, I think it's definitely that sort of dystopian, like difficult, gritty, hard to survive in type of atmosphere where it's like, yep, they sure do have technology and they sure do, have industry and they create things and look at the dark underbelly of what is required to sort of sustain this type of society. So it's an interesting thing to explore.
For sure. And all of our discussions about like how to infuse horror and, potentially create people's own domains or games that would involve these horror elements, then there's this whole section of the book that talks about these specific domains of dread. And those just feel like just inspiration and jumping off points, being like, all right, so we gave you all these tools about how to make horror. Here are a few that are, ready to use out of the box or just get you inspired. Is that kind of like how you thought about it, Wes, as you were putting this book together?
Absolutely. One of the big elements with the book is we want to really lean into the idea of you can create your own nightmares. You can tell your own stories. The domains of dread are so interesting because each one of them is its own horror sandbox. And through the course of D&D's history, there's been dozens and dozens and dozens of domains. And many of them are well known. Like, you've got Barovia with Strahd there. You've got Lamordia with Victra Mordenheim. You can continue on down the list. But honestly, the type of horror that's going to be perfect for you is going to be the horror stories that you end up creating. And we give you a lot of how do you create a Dark Lord? How do you create a domain around the torment of that Dark Lord? How do you play with genre? Great, fantastic. Now let's give you dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of like, all right, you want to take some gothic horror, you want to take some psychological horror, bam, you've got a domain like Borka. Or you want to take body horror, you want to take gothic horror, or you want to throw in some cosmic horror elements, you've got a domain like Lamordia, so on and so forth. So not only do we provide the domains of dread as these are places which are ready-made little micro settings to tell the perfect settings for these types of stories, there are also examples in a way where it's like, if you take a dash of this and a dash of this, you might get something like this.
I love that. The idea of a dash here, a dash there, everywhere, dash.
A pinch of devil worshipping, and then you're good to go.
Yes.
I mean, that's usually my shtick.
Sorry.
I have to find myself thinking like, I'm not going to do that again, right? Because, I've got a lot of the same players who play in most of my games, and they'll just be like, really, again? Amanda,
again?
Seriously?
Oh, devils.
You've been in your games.
Yeah,
My games. The devil made me do it.
Yeah.
Play what you love. Don't worry about them.
Yep.
They can handle it. It'll be a wonderful original story no matter what. So yeah, those domains are great examples of ways to kind of combine all these things. But there is, as you're saying, this idea of it being several micro settings with the Mist connecting all of them, right? So folks who know Curse of Strahd and played through that will have traveled through the Mists at least once in their thing, so they might be familiar with that. But give a kind of overview of like what is our conception and cosmology of what Ravenloft is and how people can get in and out of it or go from domain to domain.
So one of the things that's fascinating about Ravenloft and the domains of dread as a concept is it's not a planet. It's not just a place on the material plane where like, all right, you've got this country and you can walk over to another country or whatever have you. The domains of dread are sequestered in one of the farthest flung, most difficult to find secretive reaches of the Shadowfell. It cuts them off from just largely people stumbling into them or necessarily even the gods having a normal amount of influence there. But the domains of dread, while there are these each these demi-planes that are just drifting through this shadowy, mist-clouded region of the plane of shadow. They're manipulated, controlled by a mysterious cadre of forces called the Dark Powers. And the Dark Powers are best known and embodied by the mists that surround the domains of dread, which can creep into the domains and they can move people around, or they can like cause monsters to come out of them, or they can manipulate reality in whatever way the Dark Powers choose, which also means whichever way the DM chooses, which also means whatever spookiest. But they're not trapped within, they're not relegated to the domains of dread. So no matter where anybody is throughout the D&D multiverse, the Mists of Ravenloft can slip their tendrils out into the Forgotten Realms, any Eberron, any campaign setting that you might be playing at your homebrew settings, scoop up players, pass them on to Ravenloft for maybe just a single one-shot campaign or a one-shot adventure, or potentially that's where your campaign is now. But when it's done, they could also potentially release them and slip them back. In pretty much the same way where if you wanted to take Curse of Strahd and like run elements of it like in the middle of your other campaign and then put somebody back, you could do that. You can do that with pretty much any Ravenloft adventure, and the whole cosmology of the domain's well suited to it.
So what happens when you're in the mist? Like, does it like as a player? So I'm just like, I'm tooling around water deep or something. Like, do I see it? Do I feel like, am I just gone? Do I know I'm in the mist? Like, how long does it take? I need to know what happens in the mist.
Wes has experience with this, don't you, Wes?
Maybe a little. So there's a whole section at the outset of the Domains of Dread section about like, how do you use the mists? What happens when you enter them? And it can be something as basic as like, just you're traveling down the road and the mists start rising up from the ground around you and things get foggy and you continue traveling through the fog, and when finally you break out of the fog, you're someplace that you weren't expecting. And it could be as simple as that, where it's just like, great weather we're having, we're in Barovia. Alternatively, if you want to have it be more mysterious, if you want to set it up as more of a supernatural thing that has the potential to creep players out, there could be others traveling in the mist. You could run into people that are like running, screaming from the other directions. There are creatures like mist horrors, which are just monsters that exist solely within the mists. And then the complete opposite of everything that I said about having the mists work as sort of this transitory element is it's possible that, particularly if you're in a domain, you wander in the mists trying to get away because, all this sucks, let's try something else. Mm-hmm. Wandering into the mists, travel for an hour, and then pop right back exactly where you entered.
That's super creepy. So, the idea of seeing other people in there running and screaming.
the mists and like really the setup for the Domains of Dread in general are your classic haunted house story. It's just like every domain is the haunted house. Like, but we can't get out. Well, why not? Because. and the answer for the Domains of Dread is typically because of the mists. Yeah. There is no getting away from the monster because you're locked inside the house, which is the size of however big the domain is.
One of the interesting things about the mists as well is that the Dark Lord of each realm can basically open and close the doors at will. And we've actually got, I think in all of the domains, there are options for why the Dark Lord would want to bring in a player group for a reason. There's basically little quest seeds that are like, they need players to to go track down the unbreakable heart in the case of Lamordia, which is a thing that she's created that has gone off with the golem of what once was someone named Elise. They need, there's all of these different things that the Dark Lords need to sort of accomplish and can't do so on their own. So there's a reason for them to be pulled into the mists, and the mists are locked until the Dark Lord says so.
And I mean, just jumping off of that, is the transition can happen off screen too, right? So people go to sleep, they wake up and they're in a completely new place, and then that, like what we talked about earlier about like the unknown, like they have to figure out why they're there or how they can get out or what the Dark Lord asked them there for or all that stuff. And it's what's creepier than that?
Yeah. I mean,
well,
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say there are so many options in the different domains, and it can even be the old trope of a mistaken identity. The Dark Lord thinks that you're someone connected to something that's happened in the domain or something that some plot that they've got going on, or they think you're an individual person. For example, there are reincarnations of Tatiana in Barovia that Strahd is constantly after and seeking. And that's a perfect seed for a DM to use. Strahd thinks one of the PCs is an incarnation of Tatiana. Maybe one of the PCs actually is an incarnation of Tatiana. And so that's a great way to start off that campaign and let that PC discover that kind of on their own. I think is a really fun storytelling seed to use.
That's awesome. We already kind of covered a couple of these questions from the amazing audience who threw in some stuff to ask you guys. I think the one from Koto2992 was talking about this and how but the one part of their question that we didn't talk about was, is there a finite number of souls that can be in any domain at a time, and is that covered, or is it more open ended than that?
It's vague. It's something that we play with a little bit in Curse of Strahd, where the idea is that, like, if you die in Ravenloft, what happens to your soul? Does it go to the outer planes as normal? Does your god collect it? Do you get reincarnated? So on and so forth. Who has the soul? Who doesn't? All of these elements. This is something that's in the background, where if you want to engage with a story where it's like, I died and now I'm back and I realized there's nothing, like my god did not come, there is not an after, like if that's the story that you want to play with, we totally set those sort of elements up. If that's something where you don't want to play the more existential game, you don't have to. At no point in the course of the book do we suggest, all right, and make sure that you're tracking which characters have the soul and who doesn't. So we don't want to turn it into a big trivia element, but like I said, it's something that shows up in Curse of Strahd, and we explore that the dark powers don't necessarily just give folks up when they die. So if you want to play with that, go for it.
Nice. Well, following up with that, we have another question from a Dark Lord. It is Dark Lord Azalin. Says, and we've talked about the specifics of Lamordia quite a bunch, but how in depth are the domain and Dark Lord descriptions, and will we see in depth descriptions of like history and places within these domain descriptions? So Amanda, I guess I'll throw it to you because I know there's a little bit more about Barovia in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So the domains are pretty in-depth. They've each got several pages that include information about the backstory of the domain, information about the Dark Lord of the domain, backstory about the Dark Lord of the domain, and then there's a lengthy Gazetteer section before we get into things like suggesting plot ideas and hooks and things like that. And the Gazetteer section for Barovia is it's pretty widespread. It's covering all of these places that are not just Castle Ravenloft, that are not just the village of Barovia, that are providing seeds for, quite frankly, if you want to keep playing after Curse of Strahd, you can, because there are seeds that are of a high enough level that would really facilitate that sort of play. So we've got the Amber Temple in there, which is the place where Strahd made his bargain with the dark powers to become the first vampire of the multiverse. And it's implied that the things that are within this temple are very high level, very difficult to deal with, and that sort of thing. And so we really sort of take a deep dive into these places and how they became the way that they are, and how Strahd's influence really just lords over the whole place. That's the thing about Barovia, right? Is the fact that Strahd can show up anywhere, and he has the entire domain, at its knees, basically dealing with all that stuff. And it's a very sort of creepy situation going on. But we do very much go in depth, and it was something like that I struggled a little bit with, talking about how does Strahd affect this entire place? What are things that players might run into? Why does Strahd show up wherever he wants? What might be a thing to get his attention? The fact that anytime that there's a PC in the realm, he knows about it and he can visit you whenever he wants. And just kind of thinking about how that might work was something that was really fun for me, but was also kind of a struggle, because it's there's this personality, and he's really monstrous and he's a terrible person, and how am I going to work that in here? And it was fun, but I ended up consulting with another writer on the project, who is Alexander Sandgrim, and he and I worked back and forth with how sort of would this stuff work out, and what are the manifestations of Strahd. And I hope folks will like it. It's a pretty fun sort of terrifying experience,
both in writing it and in reading it, hopefully.
Yeah.
Wes, is that true for other domains, Dark Lords? Is it do they have that same level of control, or is it different for each one?
So it's a little different for each one of them, but in general, each one of the domains ends up getting anywhere from 4 to 8 pages in general, giving you here's what the gist is of the domain, here's some of the locations, but then there's a lot of focus on the Dark Lords themselves, because the Dark Lords are the central prisoners of the domains, but also really the inspiration for each of the domains. So really their history, their evil touches on everything. The Dark Lord write-ups give you not just their backgrounds and how their powers manifest currently, but also how they're tormented. Something that we really wanted to play up with every one of the Dark Lords is they're not living their best lives. They're not. Strahd hates being Strahd. He hates his situation, and he's being tormented by the dark powers. Mm-hmm. Rinse, repeat for each one of the Dark Lords, and how that feeds into the atrocities that they continue to commit, how the PCs might engage with those, and what their ultimate undoing might be. And then this is followed up by a section on types of adventures you can have there, but some manner of tent post-adventure experience. So for Barovia, it's how do you engage with the story of Tatiana? How do you create adventures around where this character might be reincarnated, what Strahd's reactions might be, how that might lead to future adventures? But then for a domain like Falkovnia, this is a domain that is under constant threat of zombie apocalypse. How do you run a siege during a constant zombie apocalypse? That section explores that. And then so on and so forth for just domain after domain.
I love maps, of course. I've made that pretty well known on this podcast. And some of the fun things about flipping through this book, Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, is that but many of the domains have a map of what that domain looks like in the geography. Yeah. And I love that they all are a little bit different. They're all, I think, was there a different artist for each one of those maps?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we employed 3 different artists at the end.
It really brings the character of the domain to life, as well as having those, super dungeon mastery bits of information you need about where things are when, and they are fantastic. So, I mean, that alone is a great portal, at least for me, and the way I consume D&D products is oh man, the maps for each one of these, and now I want to be all right, what's happening here? How can I connect these dots and come up with my own horrific stories off of them?
Nice. I mean, it's really something we try to lean into, the fact that Ravenloft isn't like other worlds. It's not, we should probably have our desert be next to another hot climate that is next to this other very natural seeming place. Ravenloft is a place where all right, you've got tundra-like lands, you've got desert lands, you've got rainforest lands, but then you've got ones that are more supernatural, here is an entire haunted city in the domain of Ikath, or here you've got Haslan, for example, is undergoing pretty much every imaginable magical apocalypse possible. Or how does a zombie apocalypse affect the environment and the map, and so on and so forth. So we get to play with some pretty wild ideas in these little sandboxes.
It sounds very much like Washington
You're muted,
State.
Shelly Bear.
No.
Shelly Bear? Why did I just call you that? I don't know.
Hi. My friend calls me Shelly Bear, actually. I was in the Mists for a while. I don't know if you guys noticed that. I did leave and go to the Mists. Fortunately, I was released quickly.
Shelly, what was there?
There's a bunch of people with eyes in the back of their head. And moths. I'm also terrified of moths. So I do feel like
That's fair.
that's what would be in the Mists. You really are writing this down, aren't you, Wes?
Mothland.
I was saying, the way you're describing Ravenloft sounds very much like Washington State, but with all of the different, like the rainforest and the desert and all the zombie apocalypse. But anyway, that's the Seattle part, probably.
Oh, no.
She's gone.
She went back into the mists,
She's
everybody.
back in the mists.
I'm right here. You can't. Can you not even hear me?
Well, I will say that I covered a lot of the questions that people were throwing in through our course of our discussion. But one that I want to just kind of put a button on this is all the inspiration we have about talking about all these domains and creating your own, right? We talked about mixing and matching genres, but what are some of the tips that you might give to people? This question is from D.A. Alton. For making your own domain of dread. And here, I'll throw this to you, Amanda, since you have some experience with the 11-month campaign you were just talking about, how it kind of feels like it might have been a domain of dread in some ways there.
Could have been.
Yeah. So what are some of the fun tips to, not go overboard on having to prep too much stuff, but combine some of the great things that we've been talking about in this podcast into your own homebrew domain of dread?
Yeah. So are you looking for tools that are in the book, or are you just looking for some general advice?
About both.
About both. Okay, well, Wes will be the best person to talk about the tools that are in the book. But, general advice is, it's very similar to the normal advice that I would give to people looking to DM anything that, might not even be horror, is to have a solid sense of the plot, have a sense of what the flashpoints are that you want the PCs to be able to uncover. And then, sort of do the world building out from there. If you are trying to build the world from the outside in, you're going to end up coming up with all these details that aren't necessarily important and aren't relevant. And you'll waste a lot of time, but you also might accidentally write yourself into a corner, basically, of saying, elves don't exist in this world because something happened a long time ago where they just never did. And then it turns out like, but it would be very cool if there was an elven type of character within this story. Who's got something, going on that the PCs need to come up with. That's not the greatest example in the world, but it is an example of a way that you can run into the problems by doing that sort of outside-in world building. So I would really have a very plot-focused, plot-driven kind of domain, figure out, how do you want the arc of the campaign to go, and then come up with the sort of basic rules that the players would interact with. And there are maybe even things going on behind the scenes that they don't ever find out about, but that you as the DM know is true about the situation. But the things that they will encounter, that they will come face to face with, having a good sense of what those are and what they look like and how they can be described, and sort of that visceral, the type of language that's used when you're encountering them, that's the important part. That's creating an illusion of this whole world when really it's just kind of the camera's focused on that story is my best advice.
I like that. And are those the tools that are in the book, Wes, that Amanda was just describing?
Well, we definitely talk a lot about that. I mean, how do you build what you need to build? I mean, it's one of the lovely things that is about making your own domain of dread is you don't have to worry about what's on the other side of the world, or have necessarily a detailed history. Something that we talk about is the concept of nightmare logic. A nightmare doesn't make sense. It's still terrifying. And part of what makes it scary is this isn't reasonable. This doesn't make sense. This bucks my expectations, yet it is still true. And I need to react to it immediately or menace. So the conversations about like, how do you play into the surreal? How do you play into physics and just what's normally true about the world, and players' expectations aren't necessarily reliable. Playing up all of that, definitely talk about that as one technique for creating terror.
Makes total sense. I love what you said, Amanda, too, about like not having to write too much, because then you'll be like, oh, it doesn't let you improv off of that, right? And so, you know, even just in talking about this, it sounds like you need a Dark Lord, you need some genres that you want to kind of focus on, and then how that Dark Lord is being tormented and the torment that they're going to pass down to the PCs. And with those three pieces of information, you can have your own domain of dread.
Absolutely. I mean, chapter 2 of the book does a lot of create the Dark Lord. How does that turn into a domain? And then here's genres. And if you want, get out your dice. Just be like, all right, I would like a body horror Dark Lord. Roll on the table. I would like it to be in a cosmic horror setting. There you go. And I would like it to have a psychological horror plot to it. And then if those that you can string those together, and or if you don't like it, just start rolling again.
You're
I love those
also
tables.
hang on. Hi, back. I'm back from the mist.
You're back.
So, but have we talked about the bestiary and these horrible monsters? Because I could populate my own domain with some horrible monsters that you've created as well, couldn't I?
There might be a monster or two, yeah.
Do you want to talk about any of the ones that you talked to our team about?
Do you want to talk about any of them? Because I seem to remember you had a few strong reactions.
The one in particular, the carrionet.
Go on.
Okay, this is what I remember. A creepy puppety thing that jabs you in the neck with a silver needle and steals your consciousness. And so it just runs around being you while you're just like there as a dead puppet. Am I close?
Nailed it. I mean, that's it. There you go.
That's horrifying. You could have just said, oh, it's a marionette, and that would have just been creepy enough. But the fact that you had to just take it a few steps further is really horrible.
Yeah, I think folks that are Ravenloft fans from way back are going to recognize a number of the monsters in the bestiary here. We play with like the full gamut of like, all right, these are monsters you might know from like classic film or folklore or whatever have you, but carrionets featured in a fantastic adventure called The Create It back in 2nd edition, where it's just like, yeah, now you've got a doll body.
Cool.
Enjoy.
The pun alone is horrifying.
Mwah. I hate puns, but that's so good. But we've also got, let's see, there's Gramishka, which are these creepy little magic allergic sort of gremlins things, where, spoiler, if you cast magic on them, like they have the potential to explode into a whole swarm. And I mean, I guess maybe don't feed them after midnight or something like that. But that's implied. What else do we have in there?
Bagman?
Yeah, so that's...
The art for that monster is absolutely
Bagman is
nightmare.
Like every party's nightmare. I love the concept of the Bagman.
Yeah. As a dungeon master, I could see why, but as a player, nope, don't want to encounter that one.
Yeah, and like that's not even a new monster. That's part of the discussion of how do you take any monster that exists and make it something that's infamous. And yeah, we play with like, how do you use folklore, fake lore, and that sort of infamous storytelling to take something that might just be something out of the monster manual and make it notorious.
Yes. And you've done so.
All of the above.
That's actually one of my favorite parts of the book. I like to just flip through the pages and
freak yourself
look.
out.
Yeah. Why not? Yeah, before bed reading.
A little light reading. before
Yeah.
sleep.
It's a little just to feed the nightmares. You talked a little bit about writing, and I told you I had a special treat for this podcast. I don't know if I told you this, Wes, but we've talked a lot about this book leading up to it, and it's really exciting to me. I like so much, like I want the dark gifts. I'm like in love with hexbloods. I love witches. I love so much of what's happening here. And I thought, I can't believe I like this because I didn't know I liked horror, but I think I always have. And then I've recently uncovered some very old, an old Rubbermaid bin in my garage, and it's filled with like old journals and old short stories and things that I wrote. And I found one that I wrote when I was in 4th grade. And I thought it would be appropriate just to read a snippet of it for you and Amanda, because
Story time.
it is called The Ghost's House. And I'm just going to read
Strong
it.
start.
Right? Okay. Here we go. A long time ago, some people say that a mean old man lived in an old shack. He died on the night of Halloween. Some people say that he killed kids when they came around. They would usually go fishing or hunting. The old man would grab a gun and shoot them. Thank you. The end. Actually, not the end. It goes on a little, but is that good? Like, did I raise the tension in that enough? Should I have like added a little more description? What do you need me to work on Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft Part 2? Because I will be.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that. Perfect. And honestly, like for being all you need to set up your own like domain of dread, you've got everything you need.
I do
right
feel
there.
like I did, and like it gets real dark. What like allegedly one of the little boys does die, and the ghost tells his friend, "You're too late. I've killed him. Go home, or you're next." So, what was happening when I was 9? I don't know.
You should ask the face that's on the back of your head still.
Yes, it was probably
Yeah.
around the time when I was having the nightmares of the eyes in the back of my head. So I think I've always loved horror. I think it was dormant for a while. I think Betrayal at House on the Hill kicked it up again, and now this has really just turned me into a living nightmare. I can't wait. Somebody please run this for me. Wes?
And this is
Amanda?
also something where it's like I tend to say this a lot. Like I like horror stories and like horror film, but I'm an absolute coward. I mean, there are
100%.
certain genres where it's just like, nope, we're not doing that, or we're fast forwarding through that, or whatever have you. So it's easy to be like, "Ooh, I don't like horror." It's like, yeah, but have you tried being the one spooking people? Like,
Yeah.
you might not be a good horror player, but you might be a great horror DM.
The one in control. That's
Yep.
different. Yeah.
The one who knows all about the scary monster the PCs can't see.
Yeah.
I think that's an older brother or older sister kind of mentality too. Is like the one who likes to be the one who scares the younger siblings may grow up to end up being a really good horror DM.
I was the younger
Ooh.
sibling.
What a good breakthrough to take to my therapist, right?
That's what I know.
I just figured out why I like horror.
Yeah, it's like, ooh,
Dragon
that got
therapy.
real.
Think about it, you guys. Maybe that's why I don't like it. I'm the youngest, so maybe well, I'll be the player. I'll take it along. But great. Well, I'm hoping that everyone is able to get Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft when it comes out on May 18th, and they can learn a little bit about themselves when they
Yeah.
read it too.
What's scarier than that?
Right?
Dive into your own psyche.
You take those eyes on the back of your head and you take a
Yeah.
good long look at yourself.
Shelly, you are going to prompt probably more than one person to start having dreams about eyes in the back of their head. So I hope that you are prepared to reckon with that.
I am fully prepared. If you take that fodder and you do with it what you will. All of you. Enjoy. Tell me all about your adventures. Wes?
We want fan art. Everybody make fan art of Shelly with eyes in the back of her head.
I don't know if
Oh
I'm
my
ready
God,
for
that's
that.
amazing.
Yes. But I would be happy to have you put that in a game for me. Bring it up. Let's do it.
Nice.
I'll tell you all my terrible fears and phobias.
Moths with eyes in the back of their heads. We're doing
That would be awful.
Well, thanks.
Take all your deep-seated fears and cast Fireball.
Yes. And then have them multiply into a bigger hive. It could happen.
Thank you to the both of you for taking time out of your schedules to talk through this amazing book. We're jazzed about it. I think there's a lot of fun, interesting, horrific stories that people can tell once they get their hands on it. Like I said, on May 18th. If there are folks who have questions online and they just want to ask about some scary things, what would be the best place for them to get the attention of both of you? So Amanda, we'll go with you and then go to Wes.
I am over on Twitter at Amanda Hamon, Hamon. So you can find me, and may God have mercy on your soul for the dumb things that I post.
Forever and ever, amen. Wes, what about you?
And you can also find my haunted house with a Twitter account over at Wes Schneider.
Awesome. Well, very excited for this book, as I've said. Amanda, glad you were able to join the team and hit the ground running and getting all this out there. And it has been a pleasure, as always. So thanks, you two.
Yeah,
so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to Shelley's internet for keeping her in the mists for this entire interview.
That was not my internet. That was the mist.